In a small, peaceful neighborhood, there lived a grandfather named Mr. Harris. He was an older man with gray hair, gentle eyes, and a smile that could light up any room. Mr. Harris had been retired for a few years now, but that didn't stop him from staying active. Every day, he followed a routine, making sure to enjoy the little things in life. One of his greatest joys was his car. It wasn't just any car. It was an old but well-maintained classic, a beautiful cherry red sedan that had been with him for decades. To most people, it was just a car, but to Mr. Harris, it was much more than that. It had seen him through all the important moments in his life. He remembered buying it when he was young and full of dreams, and it had carried him through all his years with his late wife, who had adored the car as well. They used to take long drives together, enjoying the sunsets in their time on the open road. Every morning, Mr. Harris would go outside to the driveway to check on the car. He would wipe the dust off the hood and make sure everything was in perfect condition. He felt proud of how well he had taken care of it over the years. To him, it wasn't just a machine. It was a connection to his past. The car had history, and it was a reminder of everything he had lived through. That particular morning, just like any other, he opened the door to his home and walked outside with his usual smile. He stretched his arms as he stepped onto the porch, enjoying the fresh air. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were singing in the trees. It was a calm, beautiful day. As Mr. Harris walked toward his car, something seemed slightly off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. He shrugged it off, thinking it was nothing. But when he reached the driveway, he stopped in his tracks. His car was gone. For a moment, Mr. Harris stood frozen, unable to believe his eyes. The spot where his beloved car had always been was empty. He blinked several times, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It wasn't a prank. His car had really disappeared. His heart raced as his mind began to race with thoughts. Where could it have gone? Did I forget to park it here last night? He thought to himself. But no, he was sure he had parked it right there the evening before. His car had been a big part of his life for so many years. The thought of it being gone felt like losing a part of himself. The quiet neighborhood, usually full of calm and stillness, now felt different. Mr. Harris could hear the sound of his own heartbeat in his ears as he glanced around. He looked down the street and up the road, but there was no sign of his car anywhere. It was as if it had vanished into thin air. A few neighbors, who were out watering their plants or walking their dogs, noticed Mr. Harris standing there, looking confused. One of them, Mrs. Green, called out to him. "Is everything all right, Mr. Harris?" she asked with concern. "My car. It's gone," he said, his voice a mix of shock and confusion. Mrs. Green's eyes widened. "What do you mean? It can't be. Are you sure?" Mr. Harris nodded, still not fully processing what had happened. "Yes, I'm sure. It was just here last night. Now it's gone." Mrs. Green gave him a sympathetic smile. "Don't worry. I'm sure it's just some mistake. Have you called the police?" That was the next thing on Mr. Harris' mind. He quickly went inside and dialed the police, hoping they would be able to help. The moment he hung up, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, frustration, and disbelief. How could someone take something so precious to him? As he waited for the authorities to arrive, Mr. Harris couldn't help but wonder who would steal his car, and why. The peaceful, quiet life he had always known now felt like it had been turned upside down. The day after Mr. Harris realized his car was gone, the feeling of loss still weighed heavily on him. It was hard to believe that his beloved car had disappeared overnight. He felt like something precious had been taken from him, and it was hard to shake off the feeling of helplessness. After calling the police the day before, an officer had come by to take a statement. The police officer, a young man named Officer Daniels, had tried to reassure Mr. Harris, saying that sometimes cars were stolen to be sold or stripped for parts. "We'll do our best to find it," Officer Daniels had said with a comforting smile, but Mr. Harris didn't feel comforted at all. All he could think about was how his car had been a part of his life for so long. That morning, Mr. Harris sat in his favorite chair by the window, staring out at the empty driveway. The sun was shining again, and the birds were still singing, but it all felt different now. He didn't know how to explain it. His neighborhood, once quiet and safe, now seemed strangely unfamiliar. He decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear his mind. As he strolled down the sidewalk, he noticed his neighbors going about their usual routines. Mrs. Green, who lived next door, was out on her porch sipping her coffee. She waved at Mr. Harris, and he gave her a small, weak smile in return. "I'm sorry about your car, Mr. Harris," Mrs. Green called out. "I heard what happened. Have the police found anything yet?" Mr. Harris shook his head. "No, nothing yet. They said they'll keep looking, but I'm starting to wonder if they'll ever find it." Mrs. Green nodded, her expression sympathetic. "It's a shame. You've always been such a good neighbor. It just doesn't make sense." As Mr. Harris walked farther, his thoughts raced. He couldn't stop thinking about the fact that someone had stolen his car. It wasn't just any car. It was a piece of his past. It held memories of his wife, his children, and all the years he had spent driving around the town. To lose it felt like losing a part of himself. He walked past the local park, where children were playing and families were enjoying the warm day. The laughter and chatter of the people around him only made him feel more isolated. It seemed like everyone else was going on with their lives, but he was stuck in this strange new reality where his car was gone. When Mr. Harris returned home, he was met by his daughter, Sarah, who had come to check on him. She was worried about her father, as he hadn't been himself since the car disappeared. "Dad, how are you holding up?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I don't know, Sarah," he said, shaking his head. "It just doesn't feel real. I keep expecting to wake up and see my car back in the driveway. But it's still gone." Sarah hugged him tightly. "I understand, Dad. It's a terrible thing. But we'll figure this out. The police are doing everything they can." Mr. Harris nodded, but deep down, he wasn't sure how much longer he could wait. He felt like time was slipping away, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding his car seemed smaller. That afternoon, he sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, staring at the phone. He wanted to call the police again, but he didn't know what to say. What else could they do that they hadn't already done? As the sun began to set, the neighborhood grew quieter. But inside his home, Mr. Harris felt anything but peaceful. He was beginning to think that if the police couldn't help him, maybe he would have to take matters into his own hands. The days passed slowly after Mr. Harris's car was stolen. He couldn't stop thinking about it, but he tried to stay patient. He kept telling himself that the police were doing their best to find it. However, as the days went by, he couldn't help but feel that things weren't moving fast enough. On the third day after the theft, Officer Daniels returned to Mr. Harris's house. This time, he brought along another officer, a woman named Officer Garcia. She was new to the town and had a strong, no-nonsense attitude. Mr. Harris wasn't sure how to feel about her. He wasn't used to the idea of a stranger taking charge of his case, but he was willing to listen. "Mr. Harris, we're still looking into the theft," Officer Daniels said, his voice calm but serious. "We've been checking local pawn shops and second-hand stores. We're also keeping an eye on online marketplaces where stolen cars might show up." Officer Garcia added, "We're doing everything we can, but stolen cars are often sold quickly, especially if they're old or in demand for parts. Sometimes we have to wait for the right lead to come up." Mr. Harris nodded, though he didn't feel reassured. "I appreciate your efforts," he said, trying to sound positive. But deep down, he was getting frustrated. His car wasn't just any vehicle. It was a part of his life, full of memories. He didn't want it to be lost forever, and the thought of it being torn apart for parts made his stomach turn. "What else can I do?" Mr. Harris asked. "I don't want to just sit here and wait. I need to know if there's any way I can help." Officer Daniels glanced at Officer Garcia, and then back at Mr. Harris. "You can keep your eyes open, Mr. Harris. If you see anything strange, any car that looks like yours, let us know right away. And you might want to talk to your neighbors and friends. They might have seen something or heard something that could help us." Mr. Harris thought about it for a moment. "I can do that," he said, although he didn't expect much. His neighborhood was peaceful, and he didn't think anyone had seen anything unusual. But he decided it was worth asking around. If the police couldn't find any leads, maybe his neighbors had noticed something that the officers had missed. After the officers left, Mr. Harris stood in his front yard for a long time, staring at the empty space where his car used to be. He felt like he was losing hope, but then he remembered something important. The car hadn't just disappeared. It had been taken, and somewhere, someone was hiding it. He couldn't sit around waiting forever. Maybe it was time to take matters into his own hands. Later that evening, Mr. Harris sat at the kitchen table, making a list of things he could do. He wasn't sure where to start, but he was determined not to give up. He'd spent years taking care of his car, and he wasn't going to let someone steal it without a fight. He decided to start by talking to his neighbors. They were his friends, and maybe one of them had seen something that could help. After all, they all lived in the same neighborhood. If someone had taken the car, they might have seen something strange, anything that could give him a clue. That night, as Mr. Harris went to bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He needed to figure out where his car had gone, and he needed to do it fast. Mr. Harris spent the next few days thinking about what he could do next. He knew that just waiting around wouldn't help. He had already called the police and asked around his neighborhood, but it felt like nothing was changing. Every day that passed made it feel like his beloved car was slipping farther away. As he sat in his favorite chair by the window, watching the world go by, a new idea started to form in his mind. He had spent many years as a mechanic, working on cars of all kinds. His hands had fixed engines, repaired brakes, and polished headlights. He was no stranger to the way things worked when it came to vehicles, and he knew a thing or two about how thieves operated. Maybe the police were doing all they could, but Mr. Harris wasn't the type to sit idly by. He decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. He wasn't going to just wait for someone else to find his car. He had the skills, the knowledge, and the determination. He would search for it himself. He might not have the resources of the police, but he knew his way around town better than anyone. He could look in places they hadn't thought of, talk to people they hadn't spoken to, and maybe, just maybe, find his car before it was lost for good. That afternoon, he sat down with his daughter, Sarah, to tell her about his new plan. She had been worried about him lately, seeing the stress and frustration on his face. But when he told her what he was thinking, she was shocked. "Dad, you're really going to go look for it yourself?" Sarah asked, surprised but also impressed. "You know this isn't going to be easy, right?" "I know, Sarah," Mr. Harris said, his voice calm but firm. "But I have to try. I've spent too many years with that car to just let it go. I know I can find it if I look in the right places." Sarah didn't know what to say. She admired her father's determination, but she also knew that it wasn't going to be easy. She had seen the way the police handled things, and she wasn't sure how much more he could do. But she also knew that if anyone could find that car, it was her father. "I understand," she said finally, "but promise me you'll be careful. Don't go doing anything dangerous." "I promise," Mr. Harris replied with a reassuring smile. "I'm not going to do anything reckless. I just need to start asking around. There are places I know where people might have seen something or heard something." The next morning, Mr. Harris set out on his mission. He decided to start by talking to some of the local shop owners and workers. He knew them well, having visited their stores for years. They were the kind of people who would know what was going on in the area. If anyone had seen anything, it would be them. He began by walking into the local mechanic shop down the street. The owner, Pete was an old friend of his, and Mr. Harris knew he could trust him. Pete listened carefully as Mr. Harris explained the situation. "I haven't seen anything, Mr. Harris," Pete said, shaking his head. "But you know, there's always a chance someone's trying to sell parts from a car like yours. I'll keep an eye out." Mr. Harris thanked him and moved on to other shops. He spoke to a few more people, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. Some were sympathetic, while others were just as frustrated as he was. But none of them had any new information. As the day went on, Mr. Harris's hopes were beginning to fade. But just as he was about to call it a day, he overheard a conversation between two men in the local diner. They were talking about a car that sounded exactly like his. Mr. Harris's heart skipped a beat. Could this be the lead he had been waiting for? After hearing the conversation in the diner, Mr. Harris couldn't shake the feeling that he might finally be on the right track. The two men had been talking about a car that sounded almost exactly like his, an old model, red in color, and recently seen in a part of town he hadn't thought to check. Mr. Harris's heart raced as he paid for his coffee and rushed out of the diner, eager to follow up on this new lead. He knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to make anyone suspicious or alert the wrong people, so he decided to take a quieter, more subtle approach. He didn't want to scare anyone off, and he wasn't sure who the two men were. They could have been just talking, or they might have known more than they were letting on. Either way, Mr. Harris knew he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. That afternoon, he drove through parts of town he hadn't visited in years. He was looking for anything out of the ordinary. He didn't know exactly what he was searching for, but he trusted his instincts. Mr. Harris had always been good at reading people and places, and he felt certain that if he kept his eyes open, he would find something useful. As he drove, he passed by pawn shops, car dealerships, and used auto parts stores. He noticed a few cars parked on the side of the road that looked a bit out of place, ones that didn't belong in the area. But none of them seemed like his. He couldn't help but feel a little disappointed, but he pressed on, refusing to give up. Hours passed, and just as the sun began to set, he reached the area he had heard the two men talking about. It was a rundown part of town, full of narrow alleys and old buildings. It wasn't the safest neighborhood, but Mr. Harris had lived long enough to know how to blend in. He wasn't there to cause trouble, just to look around and gather information. He parked his car a few blocks away and walked quietly through the streets. His eyes scanned every corner, every shadow, looking for any sign of his car. It was a long shot, but he had to try. As he walked past an old warehouse, something caught his eye. In the dim light, he saw a car parked in an alleyway behind the building. The car was partially hidden behind a pile of boxes, but the red paint on the hood immediately stood out to him. His heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Could this be his car? Mr. Harris approached cautiously, keeping his distance at first. He needed to get a better look before jumping to any conclusions. As he neared the alley, he saw the car more clearly. There was no mistaking it. It was his. His beloved car was sitting there, abandoned and unguarded, just waiting to be discovered. For a moment, Mr. Harris stood frozen, his mind racing. He couldn't believe it. After all the searching, all the waiting, he had finally found it. But he couldn't act too quickly. He knew that rushing in could cause trouble. He needed to think things through carefully. He pulled out his phone and took a quick photo of the car. Then he backed away slowly, deciding to report it to the police. But for now, he wanted to make sure that everything was in place before doing anything. As he walked back to his car, Mr. Harris's mind was already working on the next steps. He couldn't wait to tell Sarah. He was one step closer to bringing his car home. Mr. Harris stood silently at the edge of the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. His car, the one he had loved and cherished for so many years, was right there. He couldn't believe his eyes. It was parked behind an old, crumbling warehouse, hidden from the view of most people. The thought of someone abandoning it here, without a second thought, made him feel both relieved and angry at the same time. For a few seconds, Mr. Harris stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His first instinct was to rush forward, jump into the car, and drive it back home. But he knew that would be a mistake. He had to think this through carefully. What if the people who had stolen it were still nearby? What if they were watching the car, waiting to take it again? His eyes scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. The street was quiet, and there didn't appear to be anyone around. Still, Mr. Harris wasn't going to take any chances. He decided to wait and watch for a while, hoping the thieves would show themselves so he could confront them properly. After a few minutes, Mr. Harris saw two figures walking down the street toward the alley. They were talking quietly to each other, unaware of his presence. As they passed the alley, one of them stopped and looked over at the car. The other followed his gaze. "It's still here," one of the men said, sounding surprised. "I thought they would have taken it by now." Mr. Harris's heart skipped a beat. He recognized the voice. It was one of the men he had overheard at the diner a few days ago. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for. He wasn't going to wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, Mr. Harris stepped forward, making his presence known. The two men turned around, startled to see him standing there. "Excuse me," Mr. Harris said, his voice steady but firm. "I believe that's my car." The two men froze for a moment, their faces changing from surprise to confusion. They clearly hadn't expected anyone to show up. One of the men opened his mouth as if to say something, but Mr. Harris cut him off. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Mr. Harris continued, his voice calm but serious. "But that car belongs to me. I've been looking for it for days." The two men exchanged glances. The one who had spoken earlier took a step forward and looked Mr. Harris up and down. "We didn't steal it," he said defensively. "We just found it, that's all." Mr. Harris's eyes narrowed. "Found it? You're telling me you just happened to find my car, and now it's sitting here?" The man hesitated for a moment, then shrugged. "Yeah, something like that." Mr. Harris could feel the tension in the air. He knew they weren't telling the truth, but instead of getting angry, he decided to remain calm. He didn't want to escalate the situation. "I'm not going to cause any problems," Mr. Harris said slowly. "I just want my car back. If you return it to me now, I won't call the police." The two men exchanged nervous glances. Mr. Harris could tell they were weighing their options. After a few seconds, the man who had been speaking stepped back and gestured toward the car. All right, he said with a sigh. "We didn't mean any harm. Take it. It's yours." Mr. Harris felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let his guard down just yet. He wasn't sure if they would try to do something else once he was in the car. But for now, he had what he came for. His car was back in his hands. He walked toward the car slowly, keeping his eyes on the two men. They didn't make any further moves to stop him. As Mr. Harris opened the door and slid into the driver's seat, he let out a long breath. It wasn't over yet, but he had succeeded. He had found his car, and now he was going to bring it home. As Mr. Harris settled into the driver's seat of his beloved car, a sense of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had found the car and confronted the thieves without any trouble. For a moment, he just sat there, gripping the steering wheel and letting the quiet hum of the engine reassure him that everything was going to be okay. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the two men stand silently in the alley. They hadn't made a move to stop him, which meant they were going to let him go. Mr. Harris wasn't sure if they were afraid of him or if they had simply realized they couldn't win this fight. Either way, he wasn't complaining. He just wanted to get out of there and head back home. But as he shifted the car into gear and began to pull out of the alley, he heard something that made him stop dead in his tracks. "Wait," one of the men called out, running toward the car. Mr. Harris's heart skipped a beat as he put the car in park again and rolled the window down slightly. He didn't know what to expect, but he was ready for anything. The man who had spoken earlier, the one who had tried to explain the car's presence in the alley, was now standing at the driver's side. He looked nervous, like he wasn't sure whether to say what was on his mind. "Look," the man said, his voice lower now. "We didn't mean for it to happen like this. We didn't know it was yours." Mr. Harris raised an eyebrow, not entirely sure where this was going. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. The man glanced at his friend, who was still standing a little farther away, before looking back at Mr. Harris. "We thought the car was abandoned. We were just going to take it and sell it for parts. We didn't know it had any special value to anyone." Mr. Harris frowned. "You were going to sell my car for parts?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. The anger was bubbling up inside, but he didn't want to lose control now. The man nodded, his face showing a mix of regret and uncertainty. "We didn't know. Honestly, we thought it was just an old car someone had left behind. We didn't realize you'd be looking for it. We didn't realize it meant so much to you." Mr. Harris took a deep breath. He had expected a different answer, perhaps one filled with excuses or even a lie. But this man seemed genuinely sorry, and for a brief moment, Mr. Harris saw the vulnerability in his eyes. "I've spent years with that car," Mr. Harris said slowly, his voice quieter now. "It's more than just a vehicle to me. It holds memories of my wife, my kids, and all the good times we had. It's not something I can just replace." The man nodded, his face softening. "I get it. I'm really sorry. We didn't think it through. I promise, we won't do this again." For a moment, there was silence between them. Mr. Harris studied the man's face, looking for any sign of insincerity, but all he saw was regret. Finally, Mr. Harris exhaled and gave a slight nod. "I don't want to make this worse than it already is. Just don't ever do this again." The man quickly agreed, stepping back as Mr. Harris finally shifted the car into gear and drove away. As he left the alley behind, Mr. Harris felt a strange sense of calm. The confrontation had been tense, but it had ended better than he expected. It wasn't what he thought he would experience, but in the end, he had his car back and was able to move on. He headed home, the familiar streets now feeling a little more like home again. He couldn't wait to see Sarah and tell her what had happened. The car was back, and he had learned a valuable lesson about perseverance and about not judging people too quickly. Sometimes, things weren't as bad as they seemed. The drive back home was quiet and peaceful, much different from the anxiety Mr. Harris had felt just a few hours earlier. As he navigated the streets, he couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over him. His beloved car was finally back where it belonged. It had been a long and stressful journey, but he had managed to retrieve it without causing a scene or getting caught up in any trouble. When he pulled into his driveway, he felt a rush of emotion. The sight of the car sitting there, just as it had for so many years, was like a reunion with an old friend. Mr. Harris parked it carefully, took a deep breath, and sat there for a moment, soaking in the feeling of finally having it back. It wasn't just a car. It was a symbol of his past, full of memories and stories that he held dear. As he got out of the car, he noticed Sarah standing on the front porch, waiting for him. She had been anxiously waiting for news, hoping her father had found the car. When she saw him pull in, her eyes lit up in surprise and joy. "You did it. You actually got it back," she exclaimed, rushing toward him with a big smile. Mr. Harris nodded, a grin spreading across his face. "I did. It wasn't easy, but I managed." He could see the relief in Sarah's face as she took a closer look at the car. It wasn't just the fact that it was back. It was the fact that her father had never given up. She knew how much that car meant to him, and seeing him reunited with it brought her comfort. "I'm so proud of you, Dad," she said, hugging him tightly. "I can't believe you did it all on your own." Mr. Harris chuckled softly, his eyes bright with a mixture of pride and relief. "It wasn't easy, but I wasn't going to let it go. It means too much to me." As Sarah stepped back, Mr. Harris took a deep breath and looked at the car again. It was just a car to some, but to him, It held decades of memories. He remembered the times he and his wife had taken long drives, the laughter, the music, the peaceful moments shared between them. He remembered the trips with his children, the family vacations that had made the car such an important part of his life. But beyond the memories, it was also a reminder of his own resilience. He had fought to get it back, not just because of its sentimental value, but because he had learned that giving up was never an option. No matter how difficult things got, he had always found a way to keep going. The car, now parked safely in his driveway, symbolized that strength and determination. As the evening settled in, Mr. Harris decided to take a drive. He wasn't going far, just around the block, but it was a moment he had been waiting for. He wanted to feel the car on the road again, to hear the familiar sound of the engine purring beneath him. Sarah decided to join him, and the two of them drove together, talking about everything and nothing at all. The car, once lost and then returned, now felt like it was right where it belonged. And so did Mr. Harris. When they returned home, the sun had set, and the neighborhood was quiet. Mr. Harris parked the car in the driveway once more and turned off the engine. It was a small victory, but it was his, and he couldn't have been more grateful. As he stepped out of the car, he smiled. Sometimes life tested you, but in the end, it was always worth fighting for the things you cared about most. And now Mr. Harris could rest easy knowing his car, and the memories that came with it, were safe. In the days that followed, life slowly returned to normal for Mr. Harris. His car sat proudly in the driveway, exactly where it had been before it was stolen. The sense of relief he had felt when he first parked it there hadn't faded. Every time he glanced at it, he was reminded not only of the memories it held, but also of the journey he had gone through to get it back. Sarah, too, seemed more at ease. She had seen her father's determination and how much the car meant to him. It had been a difficult and stressful time, but seeing him succeed made her proud. She knew her father wasn't the type to give up, and that made all the difference. It wasn't just about finding the car. It was about fighting for something important, even when the odds seemed stacked against him. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Sarah brought up something that had been on her mind. "Dad," she said, her voice thoughtful, "I've been thinking about what you did. You didn't just wait for the police or for things to magically get better. You took control and went after it yourself. I think that says a lot about who you are." Mr. Harris smiled at her words. "Well, sometimes you can't just sit back and wait for things to change. You've got to do something. I couldn't just let it go." "I'm glad you didn't," Sarah replied. "It wasn't just about the car. It was about never giving up. You taught me that sometimes you've got to take matters into your own hands and do the hard work to make things right." The conversation stayed with Mr. Harris long after Sarah had gone to bed that night. Her words reminded him of why he had done what he did. It wasn't just about the car. It was about standing up for what mattered, no matter how tough the situation got. He had spent years teaching his children the value of hard work, honesty, and persistence, and now he realized that those lessons had come full circle. It wasn't just about having the car back. It was about showing his family the power of resilience. As Mr. Harris sat on his porch one evening, looking out over his quiet neighborhood, he thought about how much had changed. The world could be unpredictable, but one thing was certain. When you cared enough about something, you found a way to make it right. It wasn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It was about being determined and never losing hope. He could now look at his car and know that he had fought for it. He had done everything he could, and that made all the difference. It wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for in life. As the sun set behind the trees and the stars began to appear in the sky, Mr. Harris felt a deep sense of peace. He had fought for what mattered, and he had won. And that, he thought, was a lesson worth passing on.